Well, hello and welcome to Olive Tree Talk. My name is Mark Starbuck, and it's my pleasure to share the next 30 minutes with you. This is the third podcast by the ICEJ UK Branch, and on the program is a news segment covering some Israel and local news. I will share the second part of a series entitled An Introduction to Biblical Zionism, and we will have an interview with Joanne Lokuta, the ICEJ UK Branch Administrator. It's going to be great, so grab that cup of tea, get yourself comfortable, and let's do some olive tree talk. In the news from Israel. On April the 15th, Israel celebrated its 73rd Independence Day. It was an especially joyful day as national COVID restrictions were significantly relaxed, allowing crowds to gather and celebrate together. There were greetings from international leaders around the world, marches, the lighting of beacons, and the traditional flyby of the Israeli Air Force. Earlier this month, a Yazidi baby was brought to Israel for urgent surgery. Shevet Achim, an Israeli aid organization, arranges life-saving medical treatment in Israel for hundreds of children from neighboring countries. This was a life-or-death situation for little Henna, born in a refugee camp in Kurdish Iraq with multiple health issues. Henna is the first of 9 babies from Iraqi Kurdistan who are expected to cross into Israel for life-saving medical treatment. And now some news from HQ. The ICEJ continues its Aliyah partnership with the Jewish Agency, and the latest figures show that nearly 5,000 Olim made Aliyah in the first quarter of 2021, and approximately 20% of those were sponsored by the ICEJ. The plans for the 2021 ICEJ Feast of Tabernacles, the Days of Elijah, due to take place on the 20th to the 26th of September, are being finalized. There will definitely be another online celebration as we had last year, and the HQ is in the process of confirming what the possible scale and shape of a live celebration could be. We expect some details and further information shortly. And now some news from the ICEJ UK branch. The ICEJ UK charity was honored to be able to show love to the Druze community and support a project in one of the schools in northern Israel. Nicole Yoder, the ICEJ Vice President for Aid and Aliyah, commented, "Thanks to our wonderful British friends, the ICEJ UK branch gave an incredible gift which enabled us to supply 7 sets of projectors, screens, speakers, and 5 laptop computers for the teachers to use in the classrooms. And we at the ICEJ UK branch would say to all of you, our partners and supporters and donors, it is your giving that enables us to support these projects in Israel. Thank you so much." ICEJ UK has also partnered with Love Never Fails, a UK-based alliance of pro-Israel ministries, to facilitate the placement of a new Atlit memorial at Atlit in Israel. This memorial expresses sorrow and repentance for the treatment of Jewish refugees by Britain during the British Mandate period. Now, with the 2021 Jerusalem Day in mind, and that takes place on the 10th of May this year, the Israel-Britain alliance has recently begun a new campaign, writing to the Prime Minister and calling on the UK government to honor and recognize Jerusalem as Israel's eternal capital and to relocate its embassy back to Jerusalem. And then finally, the ICEJ UK Branch would also like to express its condolences to the Queen on the passing of her husband, His Royal Highness Prince Philip. We remember with thanks that he was the first royal to visit the State of Israel, as he was invited to plant a tree at Yad Vashem in honor of his mother, Princess Alice, who was recognized as a righteous among the nations for her efforts to rescue Jews during the Holocaust. If you would like more information on any of these news items, do contact the ICEJ UK office at info@icejuk.org. And that's the news, folks.
It is God's design to make Israel a light unto the nations. We at the ICJ are passionate about Israel and about her relationship with the world. This is why we have celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem since 1980. We have now branches in more than 90 countries all over the world, and we connect believers from more than 170 nations with Israel.
ICJ.org. Now, I want to continue with the series entitled An Introduction to Biblical Zionism. And as the name introduction implies, this will not be an in-depth study, but a simple presentation of some of the key concepts. In today's talk, we will look at the subject of covenant. Now, those who read the Bible are already familiar with the notion of covenant, as every time we open the Bible, we either go to the Old Testament or the New Testament. And these are terms that refer to the Old or the New Covenant. Now, this division of Scripture describes all of God's dealings with mankind in terms of these two covenants, the Old and the New. Now, of course, this is a total oversimplification of the matter, but it does teach us an interesting truth, and that is that covenants define the way in which God deals with creation and humanity at a given time in history, thus the notion of old and new. Covenants provide the context, you could say the staging, within which divine revelation and world redemption take place. So what is a covenant? Well, the Hebrew word for covenant is the word berith, which means to cut, and it denotes a binding contract or agreement that is enforceable and that is a legal understanding between a number of parties. Biblically, it is important to understand that there are basically two types of covenant. One that you could call conditional, that is characterized by the phrase, I will if you will. And then there are unconditional covenants, characterized by the phrase, I will. In other words, one party singly or unilaterally decides to enforce the covenant. Now, the majority of the Bible covenants are actually unconditional. The Adamic, the Noahic, the Abrahamic, the Davidic, and so on, God just announces them and brings them into force. One exception to this is the Mosaic covenant. This covenant, mediated by Moses with Israel at Mount Sinai, is in fact a conditional covenant. God commits himself to bless, to keep, and prosper them in the land so long as they fulfill certain covenantal obligations. It is an I will, if you will situation. Failure to fulfill these covenantal commitments would result in hardship in the land, for example, no rain, loss of protection from enemies, and ultimately a banishment and scattering from the land. And history records that this is exactly what happened. Now, in our conversation about biblical Zionism, the covenant that most interests us is the covenant that God made with Abraham. And of course, as we approach this covenant, two questions are critical at this juncture. And they are, is God a covenant-keeping God? And is this covenant still in effect? To both questions, we answer yes. Note that this covenant is an unconditional covenant. Let me remind you what this means. An unconditional covenant is a unilateral, sovereign act of God by which He unconditionally obligates Himself to fulfill certain blessings and promises made to the covenanted person or people. Note that in the sealing of the Abrahamic covenant recorded in Genesis 15, Abraham does not pass through the pieces, only God does. And hereby God unconditionally commits Himself to an eternal covenant with Abraham. And we believe that this covenant is still in effect and is still relevant today. We'll look at this a bit more after the break.
Hello, this is Jürgen Bühler here from Jerusalem, and we have noticed here during this current corona crisis that is going all around the world that there is a new hunger and a thirst to come into the presence of God. More and more people are praying and are praying with us here in Jerusalem, and because of that we have established two special channels of prayer where you can join us wherever you are around the world and pray with us here in Jerusalem.
ICEJ.org. We are busy considering the subject of biblical Zionism, and in particular the topic of covenant. And in our previous segment, we established the fact that God entered into a covenant with Abraham that was both eternal and unconditional. Now, the formation and establishment of this covenant occurs over a number of occasions, and you can also read it over a number of chapters starting from Genesis chapter 12. And it culminates in the events recorded in Genesis 15, where God passes between the pieces, as it were, sealing or bringing into effect this covenant. Now, all covenants contain certain promises or commitments, and it is important to note the essential promises made by God to Abraham in this covenant. If you were to make a list, I'm sure that you could find at least 14. However, in this moment, I am just going to highlight a few of the main promises made by God to Abraham. And the first is that God would make from him a great nation. In Genesis 12:2, it says, I will make you a great nation. And then in Genesis 15 and verse 5, it says, Then he brought him outside and said, Look now toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, So shall your descendants be. Abraham was also promised a land. And we read in Genesis 13:14 to 15, And the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I will give to you and your descendants forever. Abraham was also promised that he would be greatly blessed. Again, in Genesis 12:2, it says, I will bless you. And then in the very next verse, Genesis 12:3, there is the promise that through the descendants of Abraham, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. We looked at some of this in our previous podcast. So here are some of the primary promises, the main promises: a great nation, a land, a blessing, and to be a blessing to the world. These constitute some of the essential terms and outcomes of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, a question that sometimes arises is this: does Jewish sin cancel this covenant? And the answer is no, it does not. Unlike the Mosaic or Sinaitic covenant, which did have obligations and conditions, in other words, it was conditional, they were to keep the law, they were not to be idolatrous. In other words, there was an I will if you will. By contrast, the Abrahamic covenant is unconditional. There is nowhere that it says, if you do this, I will do that. God just simply says, I will. And in fact, history shows us that he has, that he still is, and he always will keep his covenant promises to Abraham, covenant promises that he swore to by his own name when he said, I will. And it is important to remember that in many of these covenant statements, the words forever are found. So this is a covenant that God is committed to keeping, not just for now, but forever. So there we are, some thoughts on the covenants.
First Christian ministry to sponsor Jews flying home to Israel to rejoin the Jewish people here in their ancient homeland. 30 years later, tens of thousands of Russian and Ethiopian and Indian and immigrants from all over the world, we've been helping them come home.
ICEJ.org. Well, today I'm very pleased to have come and join us on the Olive Tree Talk, the person that really holds the UK operation together in terms of all of the stuff that happens in the background. You know, in any ministry, there's always someone who makes it all happen. And for us at the UK ICEJ branch, that person is Joanne Lokuta. Hello, Joanne, and welcome to Olive Tree Talk.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for that introduction. Very kind of you.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely true, isn't it? Well, Joanne, you know, for many of the people listening to us, they may have received some correspondence from you or an email, but this is probably the first time they're actually hearing your voice and having an opportunity to get to know you a little bit better. So tell us about yourself. Who are you? Who are you married to? And what makes the life of Joanne Lokuta tick?
Okay, well, hello to everyone who's listening. It's great to be with you today or this evening, whenever. Well, yes, as Mark said, my name's Joanne, and I live in the northwest of England in a town called Wigan. And I grew up actually in a Christian home with my mum, my dad, and my brother. Yeah. We went to our local church, a lively, charismatic church, very involved there. And I stayed all through my teenage years. I had lots of friends and a great youth group. So, you know, I had ups and downs as you would expect, does, yeah. You know, yeah. But basically, I would say my faith was very fully grounded in those years. I had a great start, so that I'm really thankful for that.
Praise God.
Yeah. I went to university, but after that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I kind of had a plan, but it wasn't inspiring me, and I decided to put it all on hold for a year and take a year out. And some people who had been visiting our church talked about missions, and I was just really felt I wanted to go and do something. And I ended up, long story short, going with YWAM, Youth with a Mission, to Estonia on their Year for God program.
Wow.
And that's where I had a great time, a wonderful year, just away doing whatever with the church over there, setting up different things, ministries, working with youth and children, and I met my husband.
Wow.
So, it was all good.
Well, they always say if you want to meet your future partner, go to Bible school or go on mission. So,
I know. And it's actually very frowned upon, but it happens more times.
It absolutely does. And so tell us about your family. You're happily married.
We settled in Wigan. Back in my original church, we minister there together. Tanel is an elder. We've led the youth ministry. We've got 2 boys. Well, I say boys, they're 18 and 20, but they're still my boys,
Young men. Yes.
Yeah. So everything's great.
Wonderful. And that is so lovely. And Joanne, of course, we're talking to you as part of an ICEJ podcast, and that's all about Israel. So where did you get your love and interest in Israel? Where did that come from?
So, I can kind of pinpoint the start of it. Kind of a spark, really. Some people visited our church when I was a teenager from Exodus, which I think became on to be Christians Care International. Anyway, they came to our church and they were talking about the return of the Jews on the buses, that they were busing people out of the Soviet Union and taking them back to Israel. And it really inspired me. Yeah. And I remember at the time thinking, wow, and this kind of interest and compassion for the Jewish people was birthed then. And I kind of spent the next few years not really understanding what that was, but it was there, this kind of compassion for the Jewish people. But it took many years later, really, for the penny to drop, so to speak, regarding the wider implications and reasons why Christians should support Israel. That came, really only when I started with the conferences in our church.
And that, of course, was through another board member, Mike Carey, at that time was pastor of the Billinge Family Church. And that's where your connection began with ICEJ.
Yeah, so I was the church administrator, and ICEJ began holding the conferences in our church. And so by default, really, I ended up getting involved. And it was the best thing that could have happened to me, that's how I feel. Anyway, I started to hear all about God's plans and purposes for Israel, and I realized, what I'd not understood for all these years. And I kind of, the penny kind of dropped. And I think that I realized that I wasn't into replacement theology or anything like that, but I had kind of been reading the Bible in a kind of 2-dimensional way. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And then as I kind of began to understand about the Jewish roots of my faith, I think the Bible became more 3D. Yeah. I don't know, and it kind of, everything kind of fitted together.
Fantastic.
In that way.
So you went from being the administrator of the Billinge Family Church to becoming the administrator of the UK branch. Tell us a little bit about that role. What is it that you do?
Oh, it's a bit of this and a bit of that. There's a lot going on behind the scenes that people maybe don't realize. But we get a lot of emails.
Yes.
I spend a lot of my time writing and replying to those. And of course, we're in touch with head office in Jerusalem. We're in touch with the other branches around the world. We're in touch amongst ourselves. And obviously, importantly, I'm in touch with all the supporters. So there's a lot of kind of, writing newsletters, emails and posts, and sorting out the money with the donations, making sure the donations go where they're supposed to. And, we're a company, we're also a charity. So there's a lot of legal things, excuse me, that I have to do to make sure that we comply with Companies House and the Charity Commission.
Well, we so appreciate what you do, and you keep us all on our toes and keep us moving forward. And of course, one of the things that you've been busy with over, I think, the last 4 or 5 years is that you've led with Tamal the ICEJ Feast Tour. Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, I have. So that's just been a really exciting and a real blessing. I think it's every Christian's dream to go to Israel. And I always wanted to go. And I knew that I would go one day, but I didn't think it would be. I thought it would be years down the line. So little did I know I would be going so soon and so often as it has been in recent years. It's God has a wonderful way of blessing us when we least expect it, I think, sometimes.
Amen.
So it's a joy, actually, to lead the tour,
So you tend to fly in a couple of days before the feast starts, maybe do a little bit of touring, and then for the most part, you're attending the feast in Jerusalem.
We're at the feast, and we're loving it. We take a group, whoever wants to come from the UK, and it's great to go as a group, and have that dynamic, have that companionship and that camaraderie. We have a good time together. I try to arrange little excursions, and so that people they're free to do their own thing, obviously, but if they want to come and do the little excursions with us, that's great. We have a great time on the bus. 1 year, one of the guys who came with us, he made up a little ditty song and he taught it to us all so that we were singing it as we were going along on the bus. So, it's a good, fun time.
Wonderful.
But of course, you're in Jerusalem with thousands of other like-minded Christians. I mean, what more can I say, really? It's just wonderful.
Fantastic. And is anything planned for this year or the next? I mean, of course, the whole COVID situation has had a tremendous impact on travel.
It has, and I don't think there are any firm plans in place just yet. I know that there is a hope that there will be a physical feast, whether it'll be 1,000 people or 10,000 people. I don't know.
So it's a bit of watch this space.
It is a bit of watch this space. Yeah.
Well, Joanne, we have about 40 seconds left, but tell us quickly, what are you excited about that the ICEJ branch is doing at this moment?
I think the fact that we are expanding, got these new people coming into the team. We seem to be reaching more into Scotland as well. There's a few connections up there, which is exciting.
Wonderful.
The charitable side of things, raising the money for the projects and for ICJ Aid, that's really exciting.
And I think we were
all the online stuff.
We were able to donate a new bomb shelter, I understand.
We were. Yes, a whole new bomb shelter. It's going in the north of Israel. Yeah.
Well, there we are, folks. A little bit of an insight into what our administrator does here in the UK, Joanne Lokuta. Joanne, it's been great talking to you, and thank you so much for coming on the Olive Tree Talk today. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
So in reality, ICJ Aid, in partnership with the work that we do, has literally saved and protected the lives of thousands of people and all the people who are connected with those lives as well, the parents and the children and the siblings and the community members, all of whom are around each and every life. Tens of thousands of lives have been impacted by ICJ Aid.
ICJ.org. Well, there's the music, and that means our time is up. Once again, it has been my great pleasure doing some Olive Tree Talk with you, and I invite you to join us for the next podcast in 2 weeks' time on the 7th of May. I will be continuing with the series, An Introduction to Biblical Zionism, as we look at the subject of Jerusalem God's city. I will also be interviewing Mike Carey, one of the ICEJ UK board members and one of our tour leaders. Until then, stay safe and stay blessed. Bye.